optional to type your questions in the chat box. Later, I will pick some questions and read to Flores and attendees. But in this way, I guess you might miss the chance to for your follow-up question or interactive discussion with Flores. So that's why I recommend you to ask the question directly. Okay, so then let me introduce our today's speaker. Flores Delane is a full professor at the Radboud University in Nijmegen, Netherlands. He is also a PI of the Predictive Brain Lab at the Donders Institute for Brain Cognition and Behavior. He obtained a master's degree in artificial intelligence in 2003 and a PhD degree in cognitive neuroscience in 2008, both at Radboud University. And from 2007 to 2009, he did his postdoc work in the lab of Professor Stanislas Dehaene at Neurospin, Paris, France. And from 2009, Flores returned to Radboud University and established the Predictive Brain Lab at the Donders Institute, where he studied how various forms of prediction modify perception and decision-making, and also language comprehension. So in his lab, they use non-invasive brain measurements in humans, including MEG, fMR, psychophysics, and computational modeling. So today we are going to hear about his speak about prediction in language comprehension. And then let's welcome Flores to give the talk.
Thank you very much, Tao. That's a very kind introduction. And thank you for having me today. I'm happy to virtually be with you. And it's very nice to be invited. And so some of you may know, so Tao has also been an excellent PhD student in my lab and is now returned to Beijing, and where he has a post at the University of Beijing Language and Culture University. So most of my work is, I started when I started doing it at my lab, I mostly looked at vision and how visual perception is shaped by prior knowledge, effectively. But in the more recent years, I have also got more and more interested in language and also parallels between vision and language. So that's why I was also particularly excited to be invited by Tao to speak about the prediction in language, and that's what I will be doing today. Okay, so a general sort of like what you could call normative framework that has inspired me is the idea that all kind of perceptual and cognitive processes can be likened to a form of inference. And here we see sort of the famous Bayes theorem by Reverend Bayes that basically dictates how you should or what your inferences should be given the kind of data that you observe and the prior knowledge that you have in basically unconditional on the data. So now here you see an example of a visual stimulus, or you could also say a language stimulus, where your prior knowledge may help you to actually understand what it says. So here, 3 of the 4 letters are quite clear. So there's like an R here, an A here, and a D here. Whereas this one is actually ambiguous. So because there is this ink blot painted on top of it, it's compatible with a variety of hypotheses. This could be an F, or it could be an E. Maybe it could be, well, it could even be like a Greek letter gamma, I suppose. Perhaps there's other options. But given what you know in this case about what are words and what are not words, you probably quite effortlessly interpret this as the word read, and this in turn as a letter E. So this is what you could call like an example of how prior knowledge helps you in this case to make sense of the sensory input. Now, the question that has guided my lab's research for the last decade or so is this question of like how, where, or when, how, where, and when are priors, so prior knowledge, how is it used in the brain to optimize inferential processes? And the inferential processes that I've looked at most are related to vision. So, and I will actually the first study I will discuss is kind of at the crossroad of vision and language, where just like the stimulus is, where you can see that language actually helps you to interpret the visual world. But I will also present you with a study that is focused purely on understanding of spoken language, pretty much the process that we're all engaged in at this very moment. Okay. And if at any moment, by the way, is there due to a connection or for whatever reason there is something unclear, feel free to raise your hand, or maybe Tao can flag that as well. Otherwise, I will just assume that connection is good and everything's clear. Okay, so then let's go to the outline of my talk. I decided to highlight actually mostly two studies today. One that is focused on the process of prediction in reading. So how predictions that are derived from knowledge that we have may help the process of reading in the case of a single word. And this is going to be an MRI study, so a neuroimaging study. And it's going to be sort of, yeah, what I would call sort of like a classical laboratory experiment. So in that sense, it's going to use kind of like a constrained set of stimuli and a very sort of like experimentally tightly controlled setup. And I point that out because that contrasts a bit with the second study that I will highlight today, where we will look at predictions now during naturalistic language listening. So not during reading, but rather during listening, comprehension. And this will be a study where we will look at EEG and MEG data in human listeners. But this is a study that is more what you could call like a study in the wild. So here we do not have like a tightly controlled experimental paradigm, but we really have a situation where people are listening to an audiobook for like several hours in some cases, and where we try to make sense of the neuroimaging data, in this case the EEG and the MEG data, by help of some computational models. So in situations that are much closer to the more naturalistic situation and away from sort of like the more classical experimentally controlled lab-based settings. All right, so those are the two predictions that I would like to talk about. So let's start with the first. So predictions in reading, where we will focus on single words. Now, and as a background for this study, or for the motivation of this study, it is an extremely well-established finding that when you present a letter, not just in isolation, but embedded in a word, so that the letters are more easily detected when in such cases, so when they're embedded in a word. So this word might actually not be or might be a non-word for many of you, because this is you may never have heard of this town. This is the town where I live. It's called Nijmegen. It's called Nimegen. So if you have heard of this town, or maybe after I have now given you this knowledge, it might be easier to kind of like see what's written on this on this sign, compared to if you are looking at, let's say, an arbitrary set of letters and digits that you may see, for example, on the plate of a car in front of you. So that's a very well-established finding. Actually, it's one of the first findings in psychology made already in 1889, that letters are detected more easily when embedded in words. Now, whereas that is a fairly uncontroversial finding, what the reason for this advantage has been more of a topic of debate. And psychologists have fought over, or they have distinguish two sort of explanatory accounts for this, which I will call guessing-based versus perception. Now, that's what are those different explanations? Like if we start with the guessing-based account, let's imagine that this is your input. So this is so here we are looking at a word of which the last letter is degraded. Right? There's some noise here that partly occludes and degrades this last letter. Now, what could this last letter be? Now, obviously, if you have knowledge of the English language, which we all have here in the room, you know that there's like some candidates that would be actually actual words, for example, time, whereas other candidates which are also sort of potentially sort of consistent with the inputs, such as maybe TIMF or TIMP. Now, those are consistent with the input, but they are obviously not words in English. So based on sort of your mental lexicon, the words you have in your mental lexicon, you might simply say, okay, this is the input, and it activates, well, and there is like one lexical candidate that fits that input, so that's why I'm going to go for time. And that is what I refer to as a guessing-based account. You can basically guess based on this, on what you know are words and what are not words, what this letter should be. And a different account, which I will call the perceptual account, is it's similar, but it's subtly different. So here the start of the process is fairly similar. So we have this impoverished percent, which activates a particular lexical candidate at the same time. But now, rather than sort of the process, that being the end of the inferential process, what actually happens is that this interpretative process will feed back to the early sensory stages in order to try to sort of disambiguate or constrain the input, and, if you will, kind of change the actual input to make it more in line with the most likely hypothesis. So in this case, there is more like a recurrent back and forth message passing that is trying to get kind of an optimal link between the input and the higher level hypothesis, higher order hypotheses. Now, and of course, at the end of the day, there would still be then the response in this case that you're looking at time. Because so in that sense, in both of these accounts, would therefore sort of suggest that there is kind of a facilitated response for like the last letter when it's embedded within a word. Okay, so both of these accounts can account for this general facilitation of letters when they're embedded in a word. Now, there is one specific paradigm called the Reicher-Wheeler paradigm, which have tried to control for this guessing-based account by presenting letters that are both plausible words. So what they did is they had a word that was like shortly presented and then masked, and then what people had to say was whether this second letter was an A or a U. Now you can imagine that here guessing is not going to help you very much, because obviously both care and cure are actual words in the English lexicon. So in that sense, having this knowledge about words, in this case, wouldn't help you to be accurate in this particular guess. Now, they found that there is indeed still an advantage in this situation compared to, for example, when you have a non-word like RCAE, and then you have to make a guess about whether the second letter is, in this case, for example, a C or a U. So for that reason and a few other paradigms, there is like many researchers have converged to the idea that there might indeed be sort of like a real perceptual enhancement by the word, so that the word superiority effect, as this effect is sometimes referred to, is more likely to be due to a perceptual advantage rather than some kind of decisional benefit. But surprisingly, or at least when we started this study, we could not find any compelling neural evidence for this alleged perceptual locus of the word superiority effect. So that's what Misha Helbron, at that time a PhD candidate in the lab, set out to do. So what he did is actually very simple. So he presented people with this kind of degraded stimuli, or stimuli where there was like a letter that was degraded. And then the simple question that he asked is like, what happens in terms of the activity patterns in the visual system, in the visual cortex that is encoding each of these letters? Is there like a more a sharper representation of those degraded letters when those letters are embedded within a word compared to when they are embedded in non-words, by looking at the activity patterns in the early visual cortex? So that's the overall idea. Now, so to give you a little bit more detail on the actual experiment, on the task. So, so here you see the stimuli that we have used. And in all these stimuli, what we manipulated is, well, we had some words that had as a middle letter, the letter U, so which you can see here. And then we had other words where the middle letter was this letter N. You can see that this is a fairly artificial N. So the font here is a little bit unusual, one might say. But we use this font in order to sort of make the overall low-level features and the overall activation fairly similar, because they like exactly the same amount of pixels that are active for the U and for the N. The only thing that is different is really like which exact pixels, or basically whether the top or the bottom is sort of filled with pixels. Now, and then these letters could appear in either words. So here you have the word house, here you have the word sense, or those letters could occur within the context of non-words. So this would be the word AUVR, this would be DT and CA. So these are all like non-words. So that's basically our experiment. So we have middle letter U versus N, and embedded within the word or non-word. Now, so that was our main experiment. And during that main experiment, and I'll first explain that, people had blocks where so all of these conditions were blocked. And within each block, you got you got a rapid presentation of, for example, this would be a block of words with the middle letter U. So you have stuff, drums, house, etc. And every now and then there would be like a target word to which the subject had to respond. So that's basically the way that we made sure that people were attentively reading all those words. And we also had a separate localizer where we mapped out the activity profile for both the letter U and the letter N, so that we knew what the sensory representations were for those individual letters when presented in the camera. Okay, so that's our task. Yeah, here it will be like a target word, and that's the word that subjects have to make a decision on. Now, before I go to the results of this task, I think it's also important that I explain to you sort of how we thought about these contextual effects on letter representations. And we took inspiration here from already very early work by the pioneers of AI, one could say, or at least people that have also pioneered the networks that are extremely popular now, again, in the deep learning, in the deep learning AI world. And those are Jayden McClelland and David Rumelhart. So how they, or the model that they used to also model word superiority effects in reading is the following. So let's imagine we have this stimulus here, house. Now, the way that they carved it up is that they translated this, or first what they did is they added noise to these individual stimuli. So they, so when you have this word here, or the activation of these letters, and you add noise to it, you can see that now you get sort of like a more degraded version of this word house. Now, in this sort of noisy input is what is represented in this feature layer, this input layer. So here, each of these nodes is effectively one of those little sticks here of each of the of this letter slot. And nodes that are more active, so they have a darker color, are nodes that are the nodes that are here also sort of colored more darkly. Now, in the particular combination of activation of nodes here will activate particular letters. So above the feature layer, we'll have the letter layer. And you can see that due to the combination of feature nodes that are active here, there's like the strongest activity here in the H letter node, here in the O, here in the U, here in the S, and here. So that of course makes sense. And you can also see that it's not that this letter node is has complete activity and the rest is completely silent. And that is of course also due to the fact that some letters resemble each other and that there is quite a bit of noise added to the input. So here this letter layer has like a recognition each letter independently. Now in the letter layers, they project forward again to, in this case, a word layer. And you can imagine that if you have again a combination of all these different letters, that they will all sort of jointly sort of project to this word house. So if you have an H in position 1, O in position 2, etc., that will sort of strongly activate the representation of house at the word level. Now, so far what I've explained to you is what you could call a purely feed-forward architecture. So this is sort of a more fancy end-to-end version of this architecture. Is what lies at the basis of all these convolutional neural nets that are still very successful today in doing things like object recognition. But you can do a bit better in this particular situation, because if you if you inspect, let's say, the activity at one of these letter columns here, so where you, or let's say the letter unit for the 5th letter, you can see that the largest activity here is for the letter E. That's great, but that there's also quite a bit of competition by different letters, such as letter S and letter W. Now, if you would turn on feedback as they've done in this interactive activation model, where the word representations can actually also sort of enhance and inhibit units at the letter layer below it, so where you have sort of a strengthening and feedback from above to below. What you can see is that now, of course, given that the word house is mostly active, well, this instills a prediction about the activity of each of the different letter units. And you can imagine that if you have a unit that is, well, has somewhat of a noisy activity, such as this unit E here, that you can actually help the unit E here, because house strongly predicts that the last letter should be an E. So if you turn on that feedback from the words to the letter level, you can see that now actually the activity of the E unit becomes a lot stronger, whereas the activity of the competitor units like S and W is effectively quenched, becomes less active. So this is a very intuitive way in which feedback can help the perceptual inference process by sending what you could call predictions about what the letters should be seeing down, that are then combined with the actual input. And you can imagine that this process can only take place, of course, when the letters form a word. Because if you have a random letter string here, obviously that would not activate strongly any word candidate, and then the feedback should therefore then also not help anyone. If anything, it might only hurt. Okay, so that's those would be the theoretical predictions, and we tested those theoretical predictions also on the stimulus material that we actually used in our experiment. And indeed, when we compare our top-down model with just a feed-forward model, where we turn off the feedback, we find that for the feed-forward model there is no difference in representational strength between the words and the non-words. So when we look at the activity at the letter layer in our model for the correct letter compared to all the other ones, you can see that, well, the feed-forward model does pretty well. So it's like correct in about 70% of the time. for the amount of noise that we have in our system. But there's no difference here between the words and the non-words. So that's exactly as we would like to have it. But you can also see that in the top-down model, there's like an improvement at the letter level in the context of a word, but actually deterioration in the context of a non-word. So this is our theoretical prediction then. And what we were now curious about is to see whether the biology, whether the visual system also conforms to this top-down model. In other words, whether letters, when they are embedded within a word, are also like better represented in the visual system when they are embedded within words compared to words. This is what we indeed find when we in our empirical data. So here I'm showing you the analysis of the early visual cortex. So for starters, we just looked at the V1 to V4 combined, so the early visual system altogether, and we used two approaches to analyze this or to get at this question. And the first approach, which is maybe a fairly intuitive approach, is a classification approach. And what we did here is we trained a classifier, a simple support vector machine, to distinguish between U stimuli and N stimuli when they were presented in isolation. So this was during this localizer session. And then after this classifier was trained on that independent data, we then fed it those full words from the main experiment where there was a U or an N, and we asked the classifier basically to classify the U's and the N's within those full words, but then in the context of either words or non-words. And you can see that the classifier does a better job of classifying U's versus N's within the context of a word compared to within the context of a non-word. And another approach, which asks a similar question, but just uses a different analytical approach, is to look at how similar the patterns of activity were for all the U's when they were in the context of a word compared to when they were in the context of a non-word. Now here, so what we look here at is the correlation difference between the within class versus between class. So all the U's, how correlated are all the U stimuli compared to how correlated are the U stimuli with the N stimuli. Now in that difference in correlation, you can see is again a lot stronger here for words than for non-words, showing that those patterns are much more similar to each other compared to when they're presented within a non-word. Now, another question that we were curious about here is like, what is actually the neural source of this sensory sharpening? So I've shown you on the previous slide that the visual system represents the information better when it's when it's within a word compared to when it's in a non-word. Now let me just show you all the data here. Now the next question we asked here is are there brain regions that are becoming more active when there is also like a stronger representation in the visual system? So this is somewhat like a connectivity analysis, but rather than just looking at the connectivity of activity in one area with activity in another area, we're looking here at sort of an information to activation coupling. So when there is more information in the visual system, which areas are then more active? And then specifically in the situation of words, but not non-words. So that's the analysis. And then you can sort of see it also illustrated here in a plot over here. So what you see here on the x-axis is how strong is the visual activation pattern, how sharply is the visual system representing the letter, where positive numbers denote sort of more sharp representations. And on the y-axis, then you see sort of the activity in another area in the brain. And then we're looking for such regressions, so where there's like a stronger relationship between this one and this one in the context of a word compared to in the context of a non-word. Now, when we do that whole brain, we sort of nicely see that the language system, sort of the left lateralized areas within, which are classically associated with language comprehension and to some degree also language production. So those areas are more active when there is a stronger information present in the visual system. So we are speculating here that those might be sort of like source areas that may be driving, in this case, the sensory sharpening in the visual system. Okay, so let's wrap this part up then. So what I showed you is that word context indeed enhance early sensory representations of letters, so that there is a real visual effect of having a linguistic context, and that this activation of, or that this sensory sharpening might be caused also by activation of the language network. So that there seems to be a fairly direct link between activation in the language system on the one hand, and this increased sensory representation on the other hand. And what these neuroimaging data suggest then is that readers can perhaps really better identify letters in context because they literally see them better. Their visual system is literally kind of representing them more sharply. And as sort of a behavioral kind of corroborating piece of evidence for that idea, there was this behavioral study by Gary Lupien that came out a couple of years before our study that showed that when people have to match visually a target to a sample, where the target in this case is a word, you might all see that this is the word much, though it's quite blurry. So when they have to match sort of the blurriness of this word to the blurriness of this kind of letter string, what they found in this case is that when the target is a real word, a meaningful target, they would have to add sort of less blur to the sample in order to make these two stimuli subjectively equally blurry. So what does that mean? That means that you what they inferred from these findings is that you see this target stimulus as less blurry because the letters actually form a meaningful word. So here again, sort of the fact that you can make a guess, a perceptual guess about each of these letters based on your lexicon, based on your language knowledge. So that makes this stimulus subjectively a bit sharper. And because this stimulus looks a bit sharper, you have to add less blur to this image in order to kind of subjectively match it. So you can do it, of course, in two directions. So you can either make the target a word, and then you have to add less blur to this, or you can make the non-word the target, and then you have to add a lot more blurring to this target word in order to make them subjectively similar. So I think this really is a nice behavioral demonstration that is exactly in line with the neural findings that I've shown you just now. Okay, so that concludes the first part of my talk. So where I showed you how predictions that we derive from language can really affect, in this case, sort of the visual representation of individual letters and letter features in the visual system. Now, then, for my second part of the talk, I would like to move to quite a different modality and feature, namely sort of like auditory language listening. So, and other, besides from that, we're also going to switch modality. We're going to now look at electrophysiology in humans. And as I promised you, so we're going to look at like non-artificial stimuli, but really like predictions perhaps in the wild, sort of in like more naturalistic situations. And this process or this project was motivated by the question of how ubiquitous are these predictions actually? Because because the predictive processing and people that are interested in predictive coding and the process of prediction, they sometimes rather boldly claim that this is not just something that can happen, but that pretty much all neural processing can be understood as a form of minimization of prediction error. So in other words, the claim is rather big that prediction is an essential part of brain computations, and therefore it's something, sort of an ingredient that you can find back in pretty much wherever you look, whether you look at vision, language, reward, motor, learning, decision making, doesn't really matter. It's an integral part of the computations that the brain carries out. So that's the big claim that predictive processing theorists sometimes make. But when you look at the empirical evidence that is brought about to support this claim, you can see that oftentimes it's actually studied in fairly constrained, artificial, and also somewhat prediction encouraging contexts. And to give an example of that in language. So when we look at this kind of famous study that showed us for the first time the N400, which many people these days interpret as a potential marker of prediction in language. Now, what they found in this study is that when you have a sentence like "the milk was too cold to cry," that's a rather strange sentence, you may gather. So that you get sort of a very strong response to this last word, "cry." This is called the N400. Now, that response is a lot less when you say the milk was too cold to eat. And you get the lowest electrophysiological response for like syntactically and semantically correct sentences, like "the milk was too cold to drink." Now, this, the exact interpretation of this N400 effect is still somewhat of a matter of debate, but many people would hold these days that the reason why your brain is so strongly responding towards like eat or even more to cry is because these words are extremely surprising given the context. And the idea might then be that your brain, as it is kind of is processing each of these words, is forming predictions about upcoming words. And then when the actual words do not match those predictions, then you get a strong surprise prediction error response. Okay, so this has been hailed as kind of like an example of a prediction error. But to come back to sort of like this point here, that it's often studied in highly constrained and prediction encouraging contexts. So what this study actually did is they presented words like one word at a time on the screen, and at a very slow rate. So I believe this was like a 2 Hertz rate. So you have really like "the milk was too cold," etc. And you can imagine that that is really a situation that is very artificial, and indeed a situation where you are perhaps kind of enticed to try to predict the next word because you are rather bored as a subject, and you just want to entertain yourself in this way. And also what you can see here, of course, are that these prediction errors are words that don't really occur in normal language. So "the milk was too cold to cry" is not a sentence that we would usually hear. So that's another kind of point of criticism that has been raised here, where is this really something that is happening in normal language, or is this only happening when we have these extremely strange, invalid sentences? Okay, so that's those were the questions that we wanted to answer in this project. So we were curious, does the brain indeed constantly predict upcoming language also in more naturalistic settings? And if that is the case, what is the brain actually predicting? Is it predicting lexical items? Is it predicting the meaning of those items, more like a semantic map, maybe also syntax? Or is it perhaps even predicting individual speech sounds? So is it making predictions at this kind of phonemic level? Now, what was the approach that we took? So as I said, we used continuous recordings of audiobook listening. And fortunately for us, because this was also a project that was done in the midst of COVID times. So when the labs were inaccessible, so we couldn't actually record any data. but fortunately, there were some data sets that could be freely downloaded. One is a data set from the Lalor lab, where there were like 19 individuals that had scalp level EEG data. And each of these participants for 1 hour listened to a particular audiobook. In this case, this was The Old Man and the Sea, nice book from Ernest Hemingway. And each subject listened to 10,000 words and 30,000 phonemes. In that sense, you can say there's a very rich data set. There's a lot of words here. But of course, these words were not presented like one word every 500 milliseconds, but at a much more natural pace, with sometimes a longer pause, sometimes a lot of words, etc. And the other data set that we could use was a source level MEG data set, where we had much more data per subject. This was like 9 hours of audiobook listening per subject. So we had now 90,000 words and 300,000 phonemes per subject, but we had much fewer participants here. So this we used kind of like as a validation set, where we would just analyze each individual data separately, where we could get a better handle on the actual location of activity, because we had MEG data, which allows for a better source localization, and we also used individualized head casts. So each subject's head was fixated by a head cast, such that there was like hardly any motion, and therefore very high quality MEG data, and also, of course, MRI data. Now, what we have done is this audiobook, which is basically an auditory file over time, and we have brain activity that we measured non-invasively using either EEG or MEG. And then we use, in this case, a computational algorithm, a machine learning, a tool from contemporary AI called the Transformer, GPT-2. And we use this not as a model of the brain, but more as a model, as a language model, that could provide us for every word that was uttered in these audiobooks, prior to every word, we basically could calculate sort of like which word is likely to be the next word. So GPT-2 can give you an entire distribution of, like, for each word, how probable is that word. Now, and then by, say, sampling the actual word that was presented, we can then calculate the cross entropy or the surprise, which means sort of like how surprising is that uttered word given the predictions that were made based on the context. So you get a surprise for each of the words within within this audiobook. And then what we were interested to do is like to link the surprise for each word to the activity in the EEG. So a little bit more of methodology so that you understand what we did. Is we couldn't use kind of like a classical EEG analysis where you would just time lock your EEG signal to the onset of each word, because there's a lot of sort of overlap between words, and so this, it would not lend itself well to this kind of like more classical event-related averaging approach. So rather what we used is this kind of linear modeling or temporal response function technique, which was again also pioneered by people like Edmund Lalor's lab. And what you effectively do there is you create features that you from, for example, the speech signal. You can create features like the auditory features, but of course also features related to the semantic status of each word, the frequency of that word, etc. So you can calculate all kind of like features from the speech representation and from the words. And you what you then do is you add regressors, or it's like a regression approach that creates like temporal response functions that will then serve as like predictors for the EEG signal. So each of those kind of like fitted predictions will, or each of those predictors will be fitted to EEG data to establish kind of beta weights for each of these predictors in a linear regression approach. And then what will be done is that after that linear model has been fitted, it will then be sort of used to predict the EEG data on held out data. So it will, so what you then get is prediction accuracy. So to the degree that your models are actually meaningfully related to the EEG data, that they can explain variance in the EEG data, they will also be able to kind of predict in an out of set sort of like EEG, the EEG signal for words that that model has not seen. So that is the sort of prediction performance on held out data is going to be the way that we validate whether our models make sense. And this is also a nice way to do it, because then if you have an extremely complicated model, for example, that is completely overfitted, well, then it will do very poorly on out of set prediction. So you might be able to fit sort of the training data quite well, but it will not be able to actually explain any variance in data that the model has not seen. Okay, so that's for the EEG data, for the imaging data. Then for the language model, so as I said, we use this model called GPT-2. This is a so-called transformer AI architecture. And well, this is at the moment is the leading AI architecture in language modeling, because it is extremely good at for example, predicting words in text. It's also it's about as good as humans almost always, and it's also extremely often used also for like things like text generation, translation, etc. So this is really like this has largely replaced sort of like AI algorithms that came before it, like LSTMs. Now, but what we use this AI algorithm for is simply to provide us with lexical predictions. So when, for example, we have this context like "it made the boy sad too," and of course the context in this kind of architecture can be up to 1,024 words. So we really provided it with as much context as we could. Now, upon having this context, the algorithm will make a lexical prediction. So in this case, the prediction could be that the highest probability words could be think, but then also see, know, hear, read, say, etc. So there's like all these kind of lexical predictions. And effectively for each word in the lexicon, it will provide you with a probability estimate. And then upon actually, then when we see what the actual word was, we can calculate a surprise as the minus log probability of that particular word. All right, so we have three models that we compared here, and I think I'm mostly going to talk to you about this third model. So that was actually sort of like the model that we a priori hypothesized as the kind of most plausible model, and indeed also the winning model. And we're going to compare it with the baseline model, but also with sort of like an intermediate model. Now let's start with the baseline model. What is the baseline model that we used to predict the EEG data? Well, this model had regressors for the onset of every word, and that's of course like a very basic. Any basic model should include that, because there's going to be like an EEG. There's going to be an evoked potential for every auditory word. It also modeled the basic acoustic features of every word. It modeled the frequency of every word. So you can imagine that some words are much more frequent than others. For example, the word "the" in English is extremely frequent, whereas a word like, let's say harmonica or something, it can happen that you hear the word harmonica in the story, but it's a much less frequent word. Now, you might think that this is also something that you could call a prediction, because you predict maybe that the word "the" is happening much more often than the word harmonica. That's possible, but we chose to put it in the baseline regressor, because we think of this as a much more non-contextual prediction. Then, if you would want to call it a prediction, I think you could also relate to this as like as something related to adaptation, or that of course also happens just much more frequently. But yeah, critically, this is not a contextual prediction. So this is maybe just a prediction you might have overall. Now, there's also a request here on semantic incongruency. If you want to know more about that, feel free to ask me after the talk. I can explain why that's also in the model, and also sort of the word class, whether it's a noun or an adjective, etc. Now, in the model that we most interestingly, or the most interesting augmentation of this model is that we simply add here the lexical surprise of on top of all these baseline factors. And the lexical surprise is this kind of contextual surprise, and that's the minus log probability of the word given the context. So how surprising is the word given the context? And this is the way that you would calculate surprise if in information theory. So if you're employing a form of like what we call continuous prediction. And we also compare this with another sort of like more constrained form of prediction that that postulates that we don't form this kind of like continuous distribution of predictions, but that we just at every moment just predict one specific candidate. What we call like an occasional prediction, and if that's if you would do that, then the word improbability would be better modeled simply by the complement of the probability of the word. So one minus the probability of the word. So not log p of the word, but rather than just the probability of the word. Now, so this is here the idea would be more like that you're using a binary prediction error rather than a gradient prediction error. Again, if you want to know more about that, feel free to ask me after the talk. All right, so what are the results? So what I'm plotting you here first is simply how well the models are able to predict the EEG data. So how well they're correlated with the actual EEG data. And here in light pink, you see the baseline model, which and what you can see here is that that this model is doing a little bit better, but clearly the winning model is here the probabilistic prediction model. So that outperforms both the constrained guessing or the baseline model, suggesting that indeed in this kind of naturalistic audiobook listening, the probability of each word is influencing the magnitude of the EEG signal. And also in the MEG signal, we see the same for every of our three subjects measures. There's like a better core prediction performance for the probabilistic prediction model than all of the others. Now that was nice to see, but this is of course just scratching the surface. We can also ask like where and when is this probabilistic prediction model outperforming the baseline model? Here I'm showing you the where based on the average here over the three subjects in the MEG. And you can see that the probabilistic model is winning over the baseline model. So the prediction gain is largest in left lateralized language areas, which is indeed also where you would expect it to outperform it, rather than, let's say, the visual cortex, because of course these are auditory words that are processed by the language network. And when we look at the when, here I'm showing you the EEG group data for this. So for when the coefficients were actually non-zero for this probabilistic prediction regressor, for the surprise regressor. And you can see here that the lexical surprise modulates the EEG activity at a time period that is very sort of what we very similar to what we know from M400 studies. Now we can also try to disentangle actually what the brain is predicting here by looking at by trying to kind of analyze the lexical prediction in terms of what actually those predictions are. So when we go back to this example here, like it made the boy sad too, and then GPT would spit out that this is like all kind of words that whereas think is most likely, then see, etc. Now, one thing you might have noticed is that all of these are actually verbs. So when we analyze the predictions here that GPT-2 made, for example, with an algorithm like POS tagging, that is a part of speech tagging algorithm, you can see that, well, that these would all be verbs. And when we then sort of translate the lexical prediction into a syntactic prediction, you can see that in this particular situation, there is a very strong syntactic prediction that the next word is going to be a verb. Now, and then if in this case, the next word would not be a verb, if the next word would be, it made the boy sad to a very large degree, something. So then this would elicit a huge surprise in terms of the syntactic prediction. So there will be a big syntactic prediction error. Now you can also analyze the lexical predictions in a different way, namely by looking at the semantics. And what we used here is, again, from machine learning, a semantic embedding technique. In this particular case, we use GLOV. Another one is word2vec. So those are techniques to transform these kind of lexical, or these words, in this case, these lexical items, into a semantic vector of, like, say, 50 or 100 dimensions. And the way that those semantic embeddings work is that words that are semantically similar, because they are, for example, occurring close to each other in natural language corpora, those get sort of similar vectors. So these semantic embeddings have been sort of previously established. That's why we use things like word2GLOV or word2vec or GLOV, and they group sort of like similarly semantic items in. They will have sort of similar semantic embeddings, similar vectors in the semantic embedding space. And then if we have this kind of semantic embedding of each word, and we multiply it by the probability of each word, and then average, then you get a semantic prediction. So now the semantic prediction is in the space of this kind of semantic embedding. And you can then calculate the difference or the distance between the semantic prediction and the actual semantic embedding of the actually presented word. So if your semantic prediction is, well, a verb that is that has this kind of semantic average meaning, but you actually get a verb that is quite different, like fight something, or then you could imagine that you get a big prediction error, but now in a semantic space. And finally, for each of those words, you can do a pronunciation lookup, and then that will give you a phonemic prediction. And this, of course, you can do for every phoneme that is uttered. So you don't have to, the semantic and the syntactic predictions are only defined at a word level, whereas the phonemic predictions are defined for every phoneme within a word. Now, the interesting thing is that when we carve it up that way, and we look at these different forms of surprise over and above the average lexical surprise, we indeed find sort of that different topographies, and let me also put up topographies, so different topographies and time courses for syntactic, semantic, and phonemic surprise. Where phonemic surprise happens earliest, and then syntactic and semantic surprise is actually surprisingly late in this instance. Yeah, and again, we see fairly nice correspondence here between the EEG and the MEG. And I think the critical point here is that these different forms of predictions all seem to be present in the brain signal. So it's not that the brain is just predicting a semantic label or doing something syntactical, but it seems to do prediction at all these different points. And then the final piece of data before I wrap up is where we looked at whether there's also a relationship between the predictions that are made at different levels. And here we specifically looked at whether there's a hierarchical relationship between predictions that are made at a sort of like high level, sort of like a high, a lexical semantic level, and the predictions that are made at a more phonemic level. Let me illustrate that question here. So let's say that the context here is they say his father was a, and then well, the word is going to be fisherman. So upon hearing the word F, there might be you can if you would make phonemic predictions simply based on which word or which would be the next phoneme based on the phonemes that you have heard before within this particular word. So based on the word F, there might be like this particular distribution of phonemes that are particularly likely. Whereas if you would take the prior linguistic context into account here, so the fact that this word F has also been preceded by the context, they say his father was a, then your prediction would actually be quite different. So now, given that you are going to expect that there would be like fishermen, so that then you expect maybe that the next phoneme would be this I rather than, let's say, this particular phoneme here, that you would predict based on just the phoneme that preceded it before. So this would be like a prediction just within the phonetic level, whereas here we have a hierarchical model where the phonetic predictions are actually enslaved to the predictions that are made from above at a more higher linguistic level. Now we compare those two models, like the single level model with the hierarchical model. And what you can see here is that in the EJ data and also in the MEG data, I'm not showing you that here, you can see that the hierarchical model here, again, is better than the single level and also better than the baseline model, suggesting that indeed humans make kind of phonetic predictions, but that those phonetic predictions are actually informed by the higher level linguistic context. All right, so let me wrap that part up as well. So I think I hope to have convinced you that there's a clear evidence for probabilistic linguistic prediction during natural listening. So that kind of generalizes the findings that we have from the kind of more lab-based M400 studies. But I think it also really goes beyond what has been shown in those studies by showing that predictions are concurrently happening at all these different levels, and that there's a hierarchical relationship between those. So there is like predictions at different levels, which all modulate neural responses, but there's also a hierarchy of those predictions across the language network. And I think that this also really holds promise if we want to look at kind of more complex interactions, that where we really may need to go to more naturalistic settings and embrace the complexity of the input rather than try to isolate one specific aspect and come up with an experimental setting that isolates only that aspect and leaves all the other ones controlled. All right, then my final conclusion slide. So I believe that the brain is a predictive organ, that it's really an anticipatory system that is constantly trying to keep ahead of the input and try to look into the future as far as it can. And we also see these kind of predictions not just in lab-based settings, but also during naturalistic settings such as reading and listening. I also have a study on naturalistic reading where we look at eye movements during naturalistic reading, but I chose in the end not to present that today in the interest of time. But if you are interested in naturalistic reading, then feel free to also ask me about that, or I'm happy to send you more information on that. And as a final conclusion then, I think studying complex interactions between different types of contextual predictions may really require us to move towards more naturalistic settings. It might really not be feasible to study these kind of more intricate predictions and interactions between different predictions in lab-based studies. So that's, I think, the combination of naturalistic neuroscience and more neuroscience that is capitalizing on modern techniques like AI to, for example, extract rich feature representations. That might really be a way forward to understand complex processes like vision and language. Okay, finally, let me thank the people that have been really instrumental in this work. So all of the work I presented today was mainly done by an extremely talented postdoc in the lab, who was also PhD student, Misha Helbron, with help of Matthias Ekman and David Richter. And the work was also co-supervised by Professor Peter Hagort, who was also the founding father of the Donders Institute, at which I'm which I also reside. And with that, I conclude my lecture. So thanks for your interest, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you may have.
Okay, thanks a lot, Floris. Thank you. So very interesting talk. Okay, now I think, now I think it's time to ask questions. So anyone who had any questions, you can raise up your hand. Okay, we got one. Tian Wei Jie, right? Yeah, you can ask your question.
Thank you very much for your very inspiring lecture. I am the PhD student in the University of Macau, and here I have 3 questions. First, in the hierarchy prediction during natural context, I guess, you suggest that listeners first made prediction by previous phonemes. I guess this put phonemic or phonology prediction at the first place. However, according to some eye tracking data in the previous studies, the semantic prediction seems appeared first, then the phonemic or phonological prediction comes later. So how do you explain this difference? That's my first question. And
okay, maybe let's take them one by one. Otherwise, I might lose track. If that's okay with you. So you refer to eye tracking studies. Eye tracking studies are, of course, in the visual modality, right? Whereas phonemes, I mean, here we are looking at auditory listening. So I don't think there's a super direct connection there between those two forms, because one pertains to reading, the other pertains to listening. But the other point here is also that on the last slide that I showed you, there is actually a hierarchical relationship, right? So that the phoneme prediction is actually informed by the lexical, sort of like the more high level prediction of like which words are you expecting. So I think you see the surprise at the phonemic level the first, but that may be due to a prediction that is made a lot earlier. That might really be seconds earlier at the level of lexical items. And there is indeed also interesting work from Goldstein et al. Nature Neuroscience this year from Yuri Hassan's lab that also suggests that that is indeed what you see in the brain. So that you see like seconds before a word is occurring, you can already see sort of like a prediction building up related to that word.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, your studies introduced here, especially the first study of prediction in reading, so used the English language as a stimuli, but you know there are different kinds of languages. For example, Chinese, Chinese are not formed by different letters, but formed by characters. So, do you think the model do you think the way you model the context effects on letter representations are also effective in different languages, for example, in Chinese?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And yeah, indeed, when I was making this talk, I realized that particularly indeed for when it comes to reading, there are like massive differences between the reading that we study and indeed, for example, Mandarin. So in that sense, and I'm rather ignorant on this front, I should say. So I have no idea. I would be surprised if this has not been studied also within the context of Chinese, but at the same time, I don't have any knowledge of that. I think more generally, I would speculate that, that there's going to be some differences, as you say, also given the fact that the characters in English, are more basic, effectively. So whereas, in a way, maybe characters in Chinese are already sort of like closer to words. So that's at the same time, I think, we even see the effects in the brain at the level of like individual features that comprise letters. So words have an effect on letters, have an effect on features. So, and we also see when we go to more naturalistic situations of reading and listening, that entire language contexts have effects on word processing, etc. So given that there is this kind of nested hierarchical relationships in English that are, and those nested hierarchical relationships are, I believe, still also present in the Chinese. That's why I think at some level I would expect things to be the same, but at other levels I would also expect that, yeah, it's not going to be identical, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And here's my last question. Some researchers believe that the prediction process during language comprehension relies on the listener's language production system. For example, the Pickering's integrated theory proposed in 2013. So I wonder if you agree that the prediction is driven by language production system, and do you think is there any effective experiment paradigm to detect the link between language comprehension and language production directly? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Again, so I am more versed in vision than in language, I'll readily admit. So this is something that I have to think about more, but it's definitely an interesting question. I think so your question is effectively whether the system that is doing the predicting, in this case, would also be the system that is implicated in language production, right? Or whether these predictions would be made separate from a language production system. Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting question, and at first sight I don't see immediately strong evidence for that claim based on the topography that we find. So we find that the modulations that are happening, for example, in the case of like the word superiority effect, they're all within the visual system. The source of those modulations are in the language system, but I don't think that they actually conform strongly to like areas that are involved in language production, but rather more to the parts that are related to language comprehension. But I will give this more thought. So if you want, feel free to email me about this as well. I would be happy to think about that more and see how we could distinguish between that theory and a theory that would sort of think about like separate comprehension and production systems.
Okay,
yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, okay. So we have hand. So question from Paul Rian. Sorry, yeah.
Hi. Thanks for your wonderful presentation. And I want to ask that, in Beijing Language and Culture University, we study a lot about second language acquisition. So when native listeners listen to second language learners' speech, because those second language learners cannot pronounce the phonemes as accurate as native speakers. So the posterior probability of the phonemes based on their acoustic input could be much lower than native speakers. So is it okay that when we calculate phoneme level probability, we calculate one probability from the language model, which is probably n-gram language model or GPT-2, and it is multiplied by the acoustic level probability, and then we calculate the entropy or surprisal. And is it a reasonable experimental paradigm?
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I think that sounds very reasonable to me. So I think if I understand you correctly, is your hypothesis would be that for second language second language speakers,
Yes.
the phonemic, or would you be looking at the production side here, or also at the comprehension side when someone is listening to an L2 speaker?
Native speakers listening to second language learners' speech. Yes.
I see. Yeah. So I could imagine that indeed you would, in that case, kind of update your model maybe also a bit to the particular context, right? So the context that you usually, so within our data, we have a context of an audiobook where there is indeed like all the listeners are native speakers, and the person who's narrating the book is also kind of a highly trained native speaker. But so in that sense, I think it's a very interesting question to see how the effects that we find are modulated by proficiency in both the speaker and the listener. And we are currently collaborating also with a group that is doing something complementary from what you're saying, where we were looking at people who are non-native listeners. So they are also listening to this audiobook, but then they are less proficient in actually comprehending and they might have a sort of a less rich vocabulary, and therefore sort of their predictive model might be less rich than the model of a native speaker. But I think the question you're asking is also a very interesting one, where you have actually native speakers potentially sort of update their model based on sort of the information they have about the speaker that they're listening to. So that I think that is a super interesting question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think Yugen Wu also had her hand up for a while already. So I don't know.
Yeah. So Xiangbing, you are the next one.
Hello, folks. I'm Xiangbing Chen. So I have two questions. So I'm wondering, I'm super good at linguistics. I don't know a lot of phone names, but do you think when people are listening to speech, they really are perceiving phone names? Like some people think there is no phone name, and
yes. So we've decided to carve the data up in that way because it's basically a lower order unit below the level of individual of words, right? But we don't make kind of like a firm commitment to whether that is indeed also kind of like a category that people, that has a special value or something. So it's for us, this was basically just an intuitive way and a simple way, also due to the tools that are available, which can kind of, there is a system basically, and algorithms that can parse individual words into its constituent sounds in the form of phonemes. So that's why this was kind of like a simple way for us. But we don't have like I don't actually have a strong opinion on whether there is indeed like a special status of phonemes in listening. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have another naive question. So I think if people want to make some predictions, they have to know something like before, right? So what kind of this thing you think people know to make predictions across different levels, and where should this thing be, like in the brain? It's just a naive question. I'm just wondering whether you have some opinions. Yes.
So where does the knowledge reside, you mean, that is used to make those predictions?
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think this is, I can only give sort of like a hand-wavy answer, but because I suspect that knowledge is also sort of distributed, but the more you go to this kind of long-range forms of context, so not just predictions based on the previous word or something, but more predictions that are based on like paragraphs of text before it. This comes really close to the sort of like complex forms of contextual semantic knowledge. And I think some people have pointed also at the default mode network as maybe one sort of like network that is involved in this kind of high-level schemes and representing that form of knowledge. Yeah, so that would be one guess that I could make here, but I think this is a largely unanswered question still. Like what is the neural substrate of this more amodal, very large time scale knowledge representations that we use to make sense of the world.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the great talk.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, next question. So, who you been? Helen.
Hello. Thank you for a great talk. And since I am doing my master thesis on predictive processing in children with autism spectrum disorder, so I have several questions about this. It seems that predictive processing is actually a very dynamic and active hierarchical process. So could you tell us something about how would you do to distinguish those detailed process in an experiment? For example, in my experiment, I plan to use a novelty detection paradigm, and I'm very confused about how could I discriminate, distinguish those detailed process. For example, in this paradigm, a healthy participant need to first pay attention to the environment. Like in your experiment, your participant need to pay attention to the auditory input, and then they have to know how to utilize the prior knowledge to predict the incoming stimulus. And they might also modulate their predictive model based on some prediction errors. So it seems it's a very dynamic loop. So how could you confirm which stage the participant at predictive processing in an experiment? It's my first question.
Okay, that's a difficult one. So yes, so the logic of our experiment was that we are investigating sort of the model, sort of the predictive model of the brain, by looking at what it's surprised by. So because you could imagine that if there's no surprise for a certain stimulus, well then well, no, let me put it differently. So if you see sort of like for the same type of input, you see a stronger response, you see like a surprise response in the brain, then that must mean that the brain have made sort of like a prediction, a different prediction related to that. So that's why we are kind of like looking at prediction and predictive processing in the brain here through the lens of prediction error. So through the lens of like, what is the brain surprised by? And sort of like a complementary approach that we could have taken, but that we chose not to take in the experiment that I showed you, is by actually trying to see whether there's also a representation of the prediction itself. So, and then you could see like whether like words that are likely are also pre-activated perhaps prior to the onset of those words. So that would also give you sort of an idea of like it would give you evidence for like when are predictions actually formed, and then also you can see like how are they integrated with incoming evidence. So when you have a particular prediction but you get a different piece of data, then you can the prediction should of course go down if the prediction is invalid, whereas then the surprising new piece of data should actually be given more weight. So that's this dynamic process that you were talking about. And I think, yeah, neurophysiology is it perhaps in a better position to give you that kind of dynamic information compared to fMRI. At the same time, I think it's going to be always difficult to link very strongly our data, our empirical data that is quite macroscopic, to kind of like theories, like predictive coding theories that are in a way a bit underspecified often in terms of like what the different neurons are exactly doing, but also that are couched sort of at this level of individual neurons that we do not have access to typically in our human experiments. So in that sense, I think we can get inspiration from those kind of theories, but same time, I think we are, it's difficult to provide like a direct evidence for a very specific computational framework.
Yeah. So in the experiment that you presented, you use a computational analysis method. So I think it's a great analysis method to do the experiment about predictive coding, since it's kind of predictive coding, it's predictive processing is still a very general term. And do you think maybe a computational model is necessary and the only method that could draw the blueprint of the predictive brain, since there are still many other research using some correlation analysis method or other methods? So not each researcher can use the computational method.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's helpful, but it's not obligatory. I think there is also a lot of value in just asking good experimental questions. And I think if you have a very good design, or an original idea that you can test in a simple experiment, I think that's still perfect. So I think it's not necessary that we all that we only do computational models. I think that's I see computational models also typically as a hypothesis, but a bit more sort of explicit hypothesis of a particular process to be modeled. But no, so I don't think that this will be the only way that science can progress. I think we have all different ingredients and they are all very valuable. And indeed, I still also like to do say that and just empirical studies that can't just two conditions without doing any form of formal computational modeling. But I think there are situations, and I think particularly when we go to this kind of more naturalistic settings, where it is also tremendously helpful to have models that can extract features from the data that you would otherwise not be able to extract. Yeah.
Yes, and another question for the part one you presented for the letter classification. You used two type of analysis techniques: classification and pattern correlation. Do you think this method, the better results of the pattern correlation model, it's because of its own property? Maybe since using this analysis method, they have more input for this model, so they can have a better result, better performance. So it's actually the better result of this model is not the reason, not the property of predictive coding in brain, but just the property of the model.
Right. Yeah. Now I think there's quite a lot of difference between these two approaches. So that's why it's not super easy to interpret. But I think one kind of important difference between the two analyses is that the classification analysis uses training data that is from the localizer, where you just have these U's and N's in isolation. And it trains a classifier on that input and then sees how well that classifier fares on the kind of stimuli from the main task, where you have those letters embedded with all kind of different words. So you can imagine that that's quite different input, right? Where there's like a lot more on the screen.
Yeah.
So I think that that's maybe one reason why that is a little bit harder of a problem than just than what the pattern correlation is doing. Because in the pattern correlation, you're looking at correlations between all the items within the main task, so it doesn't make use of the localized data. But I also think that the inference is maybe a bit stronger that you can make from the classification approach. So in that sense, I like the classification approach a little bit better, I think, because there you train on you really are sure that you're training your classifier on a bottom-up sensory representation of just one letter. And then you see that that representation is kind of more strongly present in the letters when they are embedded within words. So that's why I think the analysis is a little bit more challenging, perhaps, and that might be why there is a little bit less, it's a little less strong, but it's also stronger analysis. I think you can infer more from it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for your answer.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question.
Okay, next question. So Wang Shuqi.
Oh, you're muted, Wang.
You need to unmute yourself. Okay.
Yes.
Hello, Professor. Thanks for your wonderful talk and study. I'm Shu Xinwang from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I have a similar question with Hu Yubing's question. I want to ask about the inconsistency between your study and the Schmidt et al. 2021 study. Because it seems that their studies results are in direct contrast to your study. They claimed that the prediction is not continuous, but event-based, which means that the processing or the prediction is sparsely updated. So how do you explain this inconsistency? Is it because they use the technique of fMRI, which has lower temporal resolution, so they could not detect the constant prediction effect? Or it's because you used a regression model while they used artificial neural networks to model the data? And these two distinct methodologies might cause the discrepancy between your conclusions. So how do you explain the inconsistency?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so I think you were talking about the Science Advances paper by Lea Maria Schmidt, right?
Yes.
I think it was Oblazer's last author. Yeah, so it's been a while that I read that paper, so you have to help me a little bit in order for me to compare them well. So I think indeed they use this kind of different LSTM models. They use fMRI, and this was also listening. Yes, so this was also listening to a story. Yes. And there, okay. So I think what they indeed try to compare is like, or they use these LSTMs really as a model of how the brain might process information. And then they find that one type of information processing, which indeed like updates the later layers, sort of the more higher order layers at a later stage. I think that that's the model that wins for them. But that I believe is also particularly the case in kind of like later areas. So there's this gradient, right? Where it's like the LSTM model works well, I believe, in early auditory areas, and then the further you go away, the more the hierarchical LSTM works better or wins. Yeah, now I don't think that we actually make that comparison in our data, because the AI algorithm GPT-2 that we use here is really not used as a model of a processing model. It's really just used as a tool to kind of get word by word surprise. And what we find is that that model, word by word surprise, works better than a model that does not include surprise, or that would include sort of like a different forms of binary surprise. So the model that we do not compare this with would be a model where where we would compare sort of like word by word prediction or word by word surprise to sort of a more hierarchical version where the surprise would maybe also be then only occurring when there's like a violation detected at a larger chunk level. So I think that is an interesting model that we could, in principle, I guess, also compare it with, but we simply haven't done it. So I don't think that our data are inconsistent with it, but it's basically just tapping into a different question or an extension that one could, I think, do, but we simply haven't done it. Yeah.
Okay,
So
thank you.
It's an interesting idea. And actually, Lea Schmidt is currently in my lab, so I could ask her what she thinks about this idea. So I think it's because this is something that that she could perhaps indeed look at. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have the last 3 questions due to the time constraint. So next Wang Ruxue.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful talk. I'm Ruxue Wang from Tsinghua University, and I have a question about the syntactic and semantic processing in our brain when we process a language or speech. As we know that syntactic effects are difficult to distinguish from semantic effects, although we can identify the syntactic position or the word category behaviorally, or we can quantify this as the model weights. Some researchers believe that our region do not need to have a specialized syntactic engine, because when we process phrases in a sentence, our brain actually combines the meanings or features of different words categories instead of syntactic structure processing. So what neural process do you think the syntactic responses in your EEG or MEG responses reflects? Thank you.
Yeah, interesting question. Thank you. Yeah, you're right. I think there, the way I presented the results may have given the impression that we assume that there was like a syntactic processor and a semantic processor, whereas I don't think that we need to actually hold such a strong position. So it's rather that, or I could well imagine that in the brain the situation is a lot messier, and that we form kind of like high dimensional representations that have both semantic and syntactic features within them. Nevertheless, I think what we see empirically is that some features are so when we analyze our lexical predictions from GPT-2, we analyze them into these kind of like different dimensions. Or you could say it's basically like a dimensionality reduction in one direction or in another direction, so to try to pick apart sort of like this high multidimensional space. We find that there is indeed like a different topography and time lag for syntactic surprise compared to semantic surprise. So I think even if these things are partly solved by overlapping neural architectures, it's still quite possible, I think, that some features of this high-level representation that are perhaps simpler or easier to extract, or can be extracted at an earlier time point, sort of may map more onto this kind of syntactic axis, so as the linguists have kind of come up with it, even though it might not have biological reality, whereas another axis that is more related to semantics and meaning turns out to be actually much later or lead to surprise signals much later in the brain.
Yeah, but we see that the phoneme surprise responses are much earlier, and then the syntactic surprise processing, and later the somatic prediction errors responses.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah. So what the phoneme surprise responses corresponds to the syntactic processing or the somatic one?
Well, I mean, given also that phonemic surprise can be is defined within a word also, right? As I also showed in this last hierarchical analysis. So with this fisherman example. So I think, especially for the last phoneme there, like if you've heard fisher and then you're going to hear man, there is already a lot of knowledge that is actually both probably syntactic and semantic, but it's there. I don't think the exact format may not even matter. I think it is, but there is this pre-activation of the correct lexical item that gives strong constraints on what the phonemic information or the auditory information should be. So that's, I think, why you get also this very early phonemic surprise, because it's, you can compare the input there very rapidly with the input that you are predicting based on strong predictions from the mental action.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, next one, Lin.
Hello, Boris, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the prediction units. I think for your research, the hypothesis is it seems like that the previous unit of some feature will predict for the present unit. For example, the phonic, previous phonic or previous word will give some information for present word or phonics. And you just think about this one unit for previous thing. And another thing is that you think this maybe have some hierarchical prediction. We have some information from word will predict some feature for the phonics. But there are also some recent papers suggest that people can maintain 3 phonics at the same time to predict the one unit of the phonics now. So what do you think about this prediction? We can hold much unit predict feature, or the structure is more important. For example, the word feature is more important than the 3 phonic feature for the predictor for this current phonic feature.
Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, I think there is an interesting paper in Eli also that has looked at this kind of like word versus phoneme prediction, where they also find that it's quite consistent with what we find as well with the hierarchical model. But they find that both at the level of phoneme, but also at the higher level of word, predictions can occur, and that at slightly different latencies. They, if I'm remembering that paper correctly, if maybe you know this paper already, otherwise send me an email. I can try to dig it up for you. I think it's also from. I think it's broadly attached to the Lalor lab as well, from which I already hinted to audio technique. So I think both of these may actually concurrently serve as predictors to some degree, where with maybe a different importance of the different features at different time points. And now the other question you asked was about like the length or the context length. I think that is also actually a really interesting question, like how much context do we use in order to make predictions about the future. And that is something that we are currently also getting more interested in. And where we hope
I think your paper suggests that from the hierarchical representation, a word is around also the same time duration for 3 phonic duration. So maybe we just use the same time window to calculate, to accumulate information to predict, or we use different hierarchy structure to use to do this prediction. So
right. Yeah, no, that's certainly an interesting question. Yeah, and I think, I mean, given that we do know to some extent that humans also, when they are asked to predict next words, that they use very long context windows. So in that sense, we even use lifetime of experience, right? So in that sense, the notion of context or window of context is even a bit ill-defined there. I think we use our lifetime of experience and knowledge and expectations. It all brings to bear to some degree on the predictions we make about upcoming words and phonemes. So that's so I definitely don't think that we'll use a fixed window at all these levels of abstraction. That doesn't seem plausible.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Liu Yiguang.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your very impressive talk. And I'm Yi Guangliu from Zhejiang University, and I was a visiting PhD student in MPI of Nijmegen. So I'm very familiar with your talk and your topic. I'm a very big fan of your second research, so I have two questions related to your second research. The first one is about the measure of the predictability of the stimuli. So you use the metric of surprisal. My question is about why not the entropy? Because in my opinion, surprisal and entropy are both some indicators related to the prediction. But from where I stand, the surprisal is more related to the difference between the expectation of words and the words and the actual words of perceived. So it's like some difference. So I think it is more associated with the integration rather than the prediction. And the integration and the prediction is on debate in related research. So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and and also nice that you have visited us in Nijmegen. I don't think we had the pleasure to meet, but I'm happy to meet now. Yeah, so why did we not use entropy? So in fact, we did also look at entropy, and it was not strongly, or it was not reliably related at all to the neural activity time locked to a specific word. So what we are looking at here is like a model that tries to predict the EEG signal of activity elicited by a word. Now, that, of course, there is a fair amount of correlation between entropy and surprise, right? So if the situation is very uncertain, you're going to have like a weak prediction, therefore also a weak prediction error. Whereas if you have a very strong prediction, entropy, well, there's like there is going to be a big surprise if the word does not conform with your prediction. So there is so when you want to tease apart the effect of entropy and surprise, it would be important to put both of them in the model, so that we're not looking at one is in disguise. Basically, when we think we're looking at entropy, we're actually looking at surprise, or vice versa. And when we do that, then we see strong contribution to the signal of surprise, but not entropy. And to me, this makes sense because entropy defines basically how certain you are about a stimulus before it has occurred. So it could, so when you have like low entropy, you have like a strong prediction, but we don't really know, that strength of prediction. I would not immediately know how that would translate in terms of like a phase-locked activity to the stimulus upon actually perceiving that stimulus. So as I also said in my talk, we're looking here at surprise through the lens, or at prediction through the lens of surprise, because the only way you can be surprised is if you had a prediction, right? So I see these two as sort of two sides of the same coin. Now, you rightly point out that you might also think of this as an integration difficulty rather than surprise. And that has been a debate in the field. I don't really have a strong position in that, except then that I'm not sure if this is a real distinction. I think you may then, if you say, well, it's an integration difficulty, the question for me would immediately be, okay, but why is it more difficult to integrate? It's more difficult to integrate because it's more surprising. It's because it doesn't fit sort of your within kind of the slot that you have put there as a function of kind of like the preceding context. So to me, that would still sort of be pointing at a process of prediction. Now, there is other work so I already referred to the work of Goldstein that actually does look also not only at the surprise after the stimulus, but also at the predictions that are formed before the stimulus. And they indeed also find that you find sort of a representation of a predicted stimulus before a stimulus is presented. But they look at this in, well, for one, in ECOG data, but also where they look at like high frequency gamma band activity over large windows of 200 milliseconds. And if you use that kind of methods, then I can imagine that you can indeed kind of find kind of pre-stimulus activity markers related to the prediction itself. But using the metrics that we use, just kind of conventional EEG activity, I think that is not very sensitive to these kind of pre-stimulus predictions that do not have a fixed temporal relationship with the word that happens afterwards. So given that our model is kind of time locked to the words that occurs, I think it makes sense that also our activity measures reflect things that are time locked to the activity of that word. And that is indeed like the surprise at different levels rather than the predictions. So in a follow-up experiment that Misha did that we didn't publish, but that might still be of interest to you, we also decompose the signal in more like oscillatory components, where we look at alpha, beta, different frequencies. And there indeed the idea was that for like more frequencies, so for endogenous oscillations that are not